Lara sat on the floor, staring at her trembling hands. She had never felt so powerless. Her whole life had been a series of suffering, but hunger, real, deep hunger, was a different kind of cruelty. It gnawed at her, making her feel like she was disappearing piece by piece. She couldn't take it anymore. If no one would give her food, she would take it. So she did the only thing she could think of. She left the hut before dawn, her stomach tight with fear and determination. There was an old man on the far side of the village who had a fruit tree, an abundance of ripe golden oranges hanging low over his fence. She had seen children sneak in and take some before, but they were never caught. She would only take a few, just enough to ease the ache in her belly. The sun was still weak in the sky when she reached the compound. Her heart pounded as she climbed over the broken part of the fence, her bare feet landing on dry earth. She moved quickly, her fingers reaching for the lowest branch. Just a few, just enough to keep them alive. She had barely plucked the second fruit when a deep, guttural growl made her freeze. Terror seized her chest. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The dog. It was massive, its dark fur bristling, its sharp teeth bared as it let out another low, menacing growl. Lara didn't think. She ran. She sprinted toward the fence, her heart slamming against her ribs, but the dog was faster. A storm raged outside, the relentless rain hammering against the fragile wooden roof. Water seeped through the cracks, forming small puddles on the cold, unforgiving floor. In the dimly lit corner of the cramped room, a young girl huddled against the wall, trembling. Her soaked clothes clung to her frail body, and her tangled hair stuck to her tear-streaked face. Her swollen eyes, filled with unshed pain, reflected years of silent suffering. "You ruined my life," her mother's bitter voice echoed in her mind, each word a dagger to her heart. "I should have thrown you away the moment you took your first breath." Once, in a remote village where dusty roads wound through thick forests, lived a woman named Abik. She had 2 daughters, but only one held a place in her heart. The younger one, Sewa, was the apple of her eye, the perfect child, a gift from her second marriage. But the elder, Lara, was a reminder of everything Abik wanted to forget. Lara had been born from a love that turned to poison. Her father, the man Abik had once adored, abandoned them, leaving her to bear the weight of shame and struggle alone. And so, she turned her rage, her grief, and her bitterness onto the child he left behind. To Abik, Lara was not a daughter. She was a curse, a scar she wished she could erase. While Sewa was showered with love, dressed in fine fabrics, and fed the best meals, Lara was treated like an unwanted shadow in her own home. She wore old, torn clothes and ate whatever scraps were left behind. If she ever dared to complain, Abik's sharp voice would cut through her like a blade. "You should be grateful I even let you stay under my roof." From the moment she could walk, Lara became nothing more than a servant. She scrubbed the floors until her fingers bled, fetched water under the scorching sun, and washed Sewa's clothes while her younger sister giggled and twirled in front of the mirror, admiring her new dresses. No one ever asked Lara if she was hungry, tired, or even in pain. Her suffering was invisible. As the years passed, Lara blossomed into a breathtaking young woman, her beauty surpassing even that of her cherished sister. But beauty meant nothing when you were unwanted, when the one person who should have loved you saw you as nothing more than a burden. One evening, as the firewood crackled in the small parlor, Abik called Lara to her side. The older woman sat with her arms folded, a cruel smirk tugging at her lips. "You are finally useful for something," she said, her voice thick with sarcasm. "You're getting married." Lara's heart pounded. "Married," she whispered. "To whom?" Abik leaned forward, savoring the moment. "To a man who is actually willing to take you," she sneered. "A blind beggar from the next village." Lara's knees nearly buckled. "Please, Mama, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Abik scoffed. her face twisted with disgust. "You should be grateful. I could have thrown you out with nothing. At least now, someone wants you." Tears slipped down Lara's cheeks, but she knew there was no point in begging. Abik's heart was made of stone. She had never been a daughter in her mother's eyes, only an unwanted reminder of a past that should have never existed. And now she was being discarded like an old, broken thing. And so, with no celebration, no blessings, and no goodbyes, Lara was sent away like an unwanted parcel. There was no feast, no gifts, not even a farewell glance from the woman who had birthed her. Instead, Abike and Sewa stood at the doorway, their laughter ringing in the air like a cruel farewell. "Maybe he'll send you back when he realizes what a burden you are," Sewa taunted, adjusting the golden earrings their mother had bought her just that morning. Abik smirked, shaking her head. "Oh no, my dear. This is the last time we see her. She's someone else's problem now." Tears burned Lara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that crying never changed anything. Instead of being escorted by family or neighbors, she was handed a small scrap of paper with an address hastily scribbled on it, a place she had never been, belonging to a man she had never met. With nothing but a tattered bag holding a few belongings, she started the journey on foot. The road was long and unkind, dust swirling with every step, the sun beating down on her already weary body. She passed villages where strangers stared at her, some with curiosity, others with pity. No one stopped to ask if she needed help. She was alone, as she had always been. Hours later, with aching legs and blistered feet, Lara finally reached her destination, a crumbling mud house standing at the edge of the village. The roof was sagging, the walls cracked with age. A goat lay tethered outside, lazily chewing on dry grass, while a few scrawny chickens pecked at the dirt. So, this was her new home. Her heart pounded as she hesitated at the doorway, staring at the house that now belonged to her. She didn't even know what her husband looked like. The only thing she had been told was that he was blind. Summoning what little courage she had left, she knocked on the wooden door. A deep, steady voice called out from inside. "Who is there?" She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Lara." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man leaning heavily on a walking stick. His clothes were worn and faded, and thick, dark glasses covered his eyes. His face was unreadable, but there was no warmth in his posture. "I am Adisa," he finally said. "Come in." Lara stepped inside hesitantly. The house was as simple as she had expected, just a wooden bed, a table with a few clay pots, and a thin mat spread across the floor. "You can sleep there," Adisa said, pointing to the mat without emotion. "There is food in the pot if you are hungry." Then, without another word, he turned away and lay down on his bed, as if her arrival meant nothing. Lara sat on the mat, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. She had gone from being unwanted in her mother's house to being nothing more than a shadow in her husband's. Days passed in near silence. Adisa spoke little, only responding when absolutely necessary. He left early in the morning, tapping his way with his walking stick, and returned late in the evening, his expression hidden behind his dark glasses. Lara spent her days cleaning the tiny house, cooking meals neither of them spoke over, and staring at the cracked walls, lost in the emptiness of her new life. At night, when the darkness swallowed everything whole, she cried into her pillow, careful to muffle her sobs. Because no one had ever cared, and no one ever would. The villagers' whispers had become as familiar as the wind that rustled through the trees. Lara had learned to tune them out, to pretend they didn't sting, but there were moments when their words dug so deep that even she could not ignore them. One morning, as she carried a clay pot filled with water into the hut, her tired arms gave way. The pot slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the floor. The sharp sound of shattering clay echoed through the small space. She froze, heart hammering. Adisa, who had been sitting in the corner, turned his head slightly. What was that? Lara dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she scrambled to pick up the broken pieces. Nothing, she mumbled, her voice unsteady. He let out a slow breath. That didn't sound like nothing. Lara kept her head down. She didn't know why, but his voice, calm, unreadable, made her feel exposed. She braced herself for anger, for irritation, for anything. But he simply said, "Be careful. Don't hurt yourself." Her hands trembled as she gathered the shards. That was all he had to say? No reprimand, no insult? Why did that shake her more than cruelty ever could? Later that afternoon, Lara went to fetch firewood from the back of the hut. Just as she rounded the corner, a voice called out, "You there, the blind man's wife!" Lara turned, startled. A woman stood a few steps away, arms crossed, eyes filled with contempt. She was one of the wealthier villagers, dressed in fine Ankara, gold bangles jingling on her wrists. "I've been meaning to see what kind of fool would end up in a place like this," the woman sneered. "Your mother must be proud." "Oh wait, she got rid of you, didn't she?" Lara clenched her jaw, refusing to react. The woman smirked at her silence. "What's wrong? Have you finally realized what you are? A discarded child, married off like a goat no one wanted?" Lara swallowed hard, willing herself not to break. She turned to leave, but the woman's next words stopped her cold. "Your sisters are probably in the city right now, living in big houses, dressed like queens. And you? You're stuck here, fetching water for a blind man who doesn't even look at you." Lara gripped the firewood so tightly her knuckles ached. She forced her legs to move, to walk away, but her entire body trembled with humiliation. That night, as she set Adisa's plate before him, his voice cut through the silence. "I heard a woman speaking to you today." Lara froze, her breath hitching. She seemed unkind. Lara felt her chest tighten. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. Adisa was quiet for a moment. Then, he asked something that made her stomach twist. "Do you regret it?" Lara blinked, stunned. "Regret what?" "This marriage." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She should have had an answer. She should have been able to say something, anything. But the question lingered in the air, and for the first time, she felt truly exposed. She had spent so long pretending, pushing her pain into the background. But Adisa's question cracked something open inside her. Her hands clenched in her lap, her pulse racing. She stammered, unable to form the words. He didn't press her. He simply nodded, as if her silence was answer enough. It happened on a night when the air was thick with heat, and the lantern barely flickered in the stillness. Adisa had come home late as usual. Lara was finishing up the dishes when she heard the sound of fabric shifting behind her. She turned, just in time to see something that made her breath catch in her throat. Adisa, unaware of her presence, had removed his dark glasses. Lara froze. His face was illuminated by the dim light, sharp and striking. His features, now unhidden, were nothing like she had imagined. He was young, far younger than she had assumed, and strangely handsome. But her gaze locked onto his eyes. They were open, focused, and they were staring straight at the wall. Lara's heart pounded. Her mind screamed at her to look away, to pretend she had seen nothing, but she couldn't move. Why was he hiding his face? Why did a blind man wear glasses? And why, in that moment, did she feel as though he could see everything? She turned away quickly, forcing herself to breathe. From that night on, Lara watched him more closely. She noticed how he never stumbled inside the hut, how his hands always found objects with certainty, how he walked through the village without hesitation. The hunger gnawed at her stomach like a wild beast. The house was empty, no yam, no rice, not even a handful of gari left. Lara sat on the floor of the small hut, staring at the single clay pot in the corner. It was useless to sit and hope for a miracle. If she didn't go to the market, they wouldn't eat tonight. With a deep breath, she wiped her tired face and pulled her scarf over her head. The sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows over the village as she stepped out onto the dusty path. The market was still buzzing when she arrived, the scent of roasted plantain and freshly ground pepper filling the air. She clutched the small bag she had carried with her. She didn't have much money, but at least she could buy something. But just as she reached a stall selling dried fish, she heard them. The men. They stood near a cluster of market stalls, dressed in fine linen, their dark skin glowing under the fading sunlight. These were not just any men. These were the kind of men who walked with confidence, men who knew they were admired, and they had their eyes on her. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, grinned as she passed. "Look at her," he murmured to the others, loud enough for her to hear. "The blind man's wife. Tell me, do you enjoy lying next to a man who can't even see you?" Lara's fingers clenched around the fabric of her wrapper. She forced herself to keep walking, but another man stepped in front of her, blocking her way. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked smoothly, his voice dripping with amusement. "Are you afraid your husband will come looking for you?" The other men laughed. "What's he going to do? Stumble in here with his walking stick?" Lara tried to step aside, but the first man reached out, fingers grazing her arm. She recoiled instantly, but he only smiled. "You don't have to live like this, you know," he continued, his voice low, almost seductive. "A woman like you deserves a real man, one who can see her beauty, one who can touch her properly." The others chuckled, their laughter thick with mockery. Lara's face burned with humiliation. She had no words, no strength to fight back. What could she even say? That she had no choice in this marriage? That her life was nothing but loneliness and unspoken pain? Another man leaned in, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath. "Tell me, Lara, what do you even see in him? Does he even touch you?" That was the final straw. Lara shoved past them, her legs trembling as she forced herself to walk away. Their laughter followed her, ringing in her ears like a cruel melody. She didn't stop until she was far from the market, her heart pounding against her ribs. By the time she reached the hut, the sky had turned completely dark. A night of silent suffering. She stepped inside, her body shaking, her hands empty. She hadn't even bought the food. Adisa was already inside, sitting in his usual spot. The small lantern cast long shadows on the cracked walls, its dim light flickering against his dark glasses. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't ask why she was late. He didn't ask why she had no food. He didn't ask why her shoulders were hunched, why her hands trembled, why her eyes burned with unshed tears. He said nothing. He never cared. Lara felt something break inside her. She wanted him to ask. She wanted him to at least notice. Even if he didn't love her, even if he only saw her as another mouth to feed, she wanted him to acknowledge her existence. But he didn't. He simply sat there in silence, like he always did. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She had learned long ago that crying never changed anything. Without a word, she moved to her usual spot on the thin mat in the corner of the room. She curled up, her back to him, and bit her lip so hard she could taste blood. The hunger was unbearable. It twisted inside Lara's stomach like a cruel, living thing, clawing at her ribs, making her limbs weak. There was nothing left in the hut, no yam, no cassava, not even a single grain of rice. For 2 days, she and Adisa had eaten nothing but water, and now even that wasn't enough to silence the pain. Lara sat on the floor, staring at her trembling hands. She had never felt so powerless. Her whole life had been a series of suffering, but hunger, real, deep hunger, was a different kind of cruelty. It gnawed at her, making her feel like she was disappearing piece by piece, She couldn't take it anymore. If no one would give her food, she would take it. So she did the only thing she could think of. She left the hut before dawn, her stomach tight with fear and determination. There was an old man on the far side of the village who had a fruit tree, an abundance of ripe golden oranges hanging low over his fence. She had seen children sneak in and take some before, but they were never caught. She would only take a few, just enough to ease the ache in her belly. The sun was still weak in the sky when she reached the compound. Her heart pounded as she climbed over the broken part of the fence, her bare feet landing on dry earth. She moved quickly, her fingers reaching for the lowest branch. Just a few, just enough to keep them alive. She had barely plucked the second fruit when a deep, guttural growl made her freeze. Terror seized her chest. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The dog. It was massive, its dark fur bristling, its sharp teeth bared as it let out another low, menacing growl. Lara didn't think. She ran. She sprinted toward the fence, her heart slamming against her ribs, but the dog was faster. She felt its weight crash into her back, sharp claws tearing into her flesh. She screamed as she hit the ground, pain exploding across her arm and leg as the beast's teeth sank into her skin. With one final, desperate kick, she freed herself, scrambling over the fence and falling onto the road. Her body trembled violently as she lay there, panting, her arms covered in dirt and blood. The oranges had rolled away from her grasp, lost in the dust. She had nothing except the pain of her torn skin and the burning humiliation of her failure. By the time she limped back to the hut, the sun had climbed higher in the sky. Her body ached, her dress was torn, and her wounds stung with every step. Adisa was sitting by the doorway, his face turned slightly toward the sound of her footsteps. Even through the pain, Lara couldn't help but wonder, how had he known she was coming? She tried to move past him, tried to hide the shame in her eyes, but his voice stopped her. What happened? Lara froze. She couldn't remember the last time he had asked about her. Not about food, not about chores, but about her. She swallowed hard, fighting back the tears burning behind her eyes. Nothing, she murmured, attempting to step inside. But Adisa reached out, his hand brushing against her wrist. She gasped softly, surprised by the warmth of his touch. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't forceful. It was just there. Sit, he said quietly. Lara hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the wooden stool near the door. Adisa reached for the small cloth hanging by the water pot, dipping it into the cool liquid. Without a word, he took her arm, his fingers carefully avoiding the torn flesh, and began dabbing at the wounds. The silence stretched between them, heavy and full of things unsaid. Lara clenched her jaw. I went to get us food, she finally admitted. I thought I could bring something back for us. Adisa's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed their gentle work. You stole, he said, not with judgment, but with understanding. Lara let out a shaky breath. I tried. I failed. A moment of silence passed, then Adisa sighed. You shouldn't have to steal to eat. She let out a bitter laugh. What other choice do we have? She expected him to have no answer. She expected the silence to return, but instead, he spoke softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I hate this. Lara looked up sharply. What? Adisa dipped the cloth into the water again, wringing it out slowly. I hate hearing you suffer. I hate knowing I can do nothing. Her chest tightened painfully. He had never said anything like that before. For the first time, she saw something in him she had never noticed, a quiet, heavy